Dave, it's so great to connect today. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So you and I go back a little ways. We shared an office together for 5 years at the University of Utah. After graduation, you moved to China. I moved to South Bend. Of course, we've stayed in touch. Now you're in Indiana, where we were nearby. So anyway, great to reconnect. And you have such an interesting history, both before the PhD and after. But we're going to kind of focus on what happened after we were office mates. And so, first thing I want to hear now is remind me how many kids you have now.
So we just had number 9 3 weeks ago.
Okay, you just had number nine. And how did you and your wife decide to have so many children?
So that's a good question. Growing up, I grew up in a big family. I always wanted a big family. I love having siblings. It's like the most amazing support network. Um, I wasn't positive that I'd ever find somebody that wanted a big family. But when we were dating, we finally got to the point where I asked her, have you thought about how many kids you'd like to have someday? And she said that she'd always wanted 10. And I was shocked.
Wow.
So that's where it started.
And is that still the goal?
We don't have goals. We gave up. Well, we never started really with a number in mind. We just wanted to have as many as felt right. So we just kind of take them one at a time. And people always ask us if we have twins, and we do not. They've all been one at a time.
I admire that so much and I respect it. And I have six siblings, and the older we get, every time we get together with all of the cousins, nieces, nephews, aunts, uncle, it's just amazing. So I love that and I admire it, like I said. So you ended up in China, not with nine kids, of course, because this was a few years ago, but how did you end up in China with your children?
Great question. So, when I was younger, before I was married, I was a missionary, and as a missionary, I learned Chinese. So, I kind of always had this idea in the back of my mind that I wanted to eventually live in China, because as a missionary, I was not in China, but I was speaking Chinese. So, I wanted to get to mainland China someday. And I also really wanted my kids to have an international experience. I spoke Chinese to them at home. They were bilingual, but had not had that opportunity to live abroad. So I really was looking for an opportunity to get to China or to Asia or somewhere where they could have an international experience.
So we were on the job market together and we're kind of applying to some of the same jobs. And then this job with NYU Shanghai comes up and it's like, okay, yeah, I'm definitely not applying to that one. You got it. You get this job at Shanghai. And so I know you could talk for days and months and years, literally, if we really wanted to capture what that was like. It's like you can only replicate it to really appreciate it. But you end up getting this job offer from Shanghai. So how many children did you have at this time? And then what was that like moving your family or accepting the offer and then moving to China?
Yeah, so at the time we had 5 children. Our youngest, when we moved, was a year and a half. He was almost a year when we accepted the offer. We had about 9 months to prepare from the time we accepted the offer until we actually went, which was good. We had a lot of preparing to do, and it was definitely a challenge. It was a challenge here at home. There were, family members that were skeptical, and we had major concerns about it as well, but we really felt like it was the right thing to do for our family. When we arrived, the real challenges started, and there are a lot that we could talk about. But just as an example, the morning after we arrived, we had to be across the city at 8 a.m. to meet with HR, and so without food or water for our kids, we made the trek across the city to go meet with HR. And when we showed up, they said, "We need you to fill out this paperwork." And their paperwork only went up to 4 dependents, and that was that
Oh,
was kind of our first encounter. I said, "Well, we can't really fill this out because we have more dependents than your form can handle." But everything was like that. I mean, we didn't know anybody in the country with that many kids, and it didn't seem like anybody else did either. So it was every day was a new adventure.
so remind me how many people live in Shanghai and what is Shanghai like?
So Shanghai has, I think the official population count is somewhere around 24 to 25 million, but that does not, from what I understand, that does not include the migrant workers that come in. So it's probably closer to maybe 29 or 30 million. Just to put that in perspective, that is nearly, it's like 3.5 to 4 times the size of Manhattan.
That's wild.
Um, so it's a huge city, and when I say migrant population, I mean migrant like Chinese people from other provinces, because China has a very strict immigration policy, even domestically. So it kind of keeps people mostly in the areas in which they were born.
So, what did you eat when you got to China, and how did your kids adapt to that?
Yeah, actually, before we went, we lived in a place that had a large Chinese population even before we went to China. And so we asked some of our Chinese neighbors if they would show us some meals that we could cook. Um, Bread is harder to get in China. Milk is harder to get in China. Things that were, we were coming out of school, things that were cheap meals here, like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, all of a sudden were very expensive.
Hmm.
So we've always eaten a lot of rice. We leaned into that. We ate a lot of rice. Um, we did find pasta there at, some international markets. We kind of ate a mixture of things from that were imported, and then, ate what we could locally that we could slowly learn how to cook and prepare. But a lot of rice. Strangely, a lot of like tacos because they do have tortillas there that are
Hmm.
readily available. A lot of dumplings, things like that.
Did your kids end up liking the food, or were they mostly just tolerating it while you were there?
My kids love the food, and they really really love the food. They tolerated, probably the more authentically Chinese things that they would get like at school lunch. But the things that we made at home they really loved, and we found local dishes that we really loved and still love. I still have dumplings in my freezer right
Cool.
now because my kids get so excited when we have them.
One thing I feel like I've learned over the years is that not only do our taste buds change, we can actually change our taste buds ourselves by what we expose ourselves to. So I'm actually not surprised to hear that they ended up loving the food. So where did you end up living in Shanghai?
We ended up, upon arrival, we had 2 weeks to pick an apartment and ended up living about a 15-minute bike ride from the university that I worked at, um, and we were on the 31st floor of a high rise.
Wow.
We found a place that was about 1,100 square feet. It's hard to know for sure because they calculate square footage differently than we do. It was about 1,100 square feet and in a high rise, and that's where we lived.
31st floor. Amazing. And what sort of activities were your kids involved in while you were there?
One of the challenges, actually, one of the biggest challenges was that with a big family, you want to be able to send the kids out and play. You want them to be able to play outside, and so there were two problems with that. One was the pollution was so bad. There was probably 1 or 2 days a month where we felt like, you know, that we wouldn't feel guilty as parents for
Wow.
sending them outside to play. So there were not a lot of days that we could go outside and play. Aside from that, it's very difficult to get that many, at the time our oldest was 8 years old. And so that many young kids get everybody's shoes on, get down the elevator. As soon as you get out and find a spot, somebody's got to go to the bathroom. So logistically it was very challenging for us to get outside um, to play. And that was one of the challenges.
So what did you do in the apartment to entertain the kids?
The kids were homeschooled at first because, and this is a different conversation, but because of the challenge of getting them into school, we homeschooled for a while. We would do dancing, we do games upstairs. We would just kind of live life, just without the luxury of being able to go outside when we wanted.
Okay, so you homeschooled for a while and then you ended up enrolling your kids in public school. What was that like?
So it wasn't actually public school because Shanghai has a city law that foreigners are not allowed to go to public school. And so
Okay.
that was one of our challenges. It had to be a private school. And Shanghai is number one in the world for expensive expat schools.
Wow.
So just to give you an idea, to educate a kindergartner in Shanghai at an American school is about 55,000 US dollars a year for
Oh
one
my
child.
gosh.
So instead, we found, a different arrangement. It was actually a Taiwanese school, but they used an American curriculum and they had foreign teachers. It was about an hour from our home, and so the kids went there for about a year and a half, and it was a good experience. It was a tough experience, but that's what worked for us at the time.
So you hear about schools being so intense in China, and was that your experience?
That was definitely our experience. We would get the kids up at 5 because they needed to be out the door by 5:50. The nearest bus stop was a kilometer walk, so we would walk a kilometer to the bus stop, and then they would ride the bus for about 40 minutes to an hour, depending on, traffic and other things, to the school. And then they would have their full day of school. They would ride the bus for about an hour home, walk home. They'd get home around 4:30. We would quickly eat dinner, and then starting in first grade, the norm was 3 hours of homework a night.
Oh my gosh.
So our kids would do homework from about 5:30 to 8:30. We'd try to get them in bed by 9 so they could get up at 5 again the next day. But honestly, we had the easiest schedule of any of the kids in their classes because we decided as a family that that's all we could handle. We were not going to do extracurricular, but most of the kids in their classes after homework or after dinner would go to additional classes. They'd have like another English class in the evening or another math class or piano lessons or whatever. So most of the kids in their classes, I would say, were sleeping, we're going to sleep around 11 or 12 at night. And these are first and second graders.
Yeah, that was my next question then. I mean, your kids are putting in 16-hour days.
Yeah, it was a very long day.
And how is there time for more on top of that? So do they value sleep differently in China generally than we do here in the US?
That's a good question. I don't think it's not that they don't value sleep. I think what they value most is educational attainment. And unfortunately, in China, it's not like in the United States where, if you want to go to college, you can. You may not go to Harvard, but there will be an option for you. If you want to go to college, you can go to community college or you can go, basically in the United States, people can kind of squander their time in grade school and still eventually make it work. But in China, that's not the case. There are very few seats in college at all. Many students are forced to drop out after ninth grade, and if you do make it through senior year, it's definitely not guaranteed that you will get into college. And so it's just a very, very competitive mindset. And we found moving there, one of the challenges of getting into school, we found that the hardest grade to get your kid into is first grade. It's harder to get your kid into first grade than to get your kid into college because it's so competitive that there are only certain schools that will get you into the next school that will get you into the next school that will get you the right grades to get into college. And so it's very, very competitive from a young age. Just a little example of that. One of my sons was in kindergarten, which in China is not required, but he went to kindergarten and they had passed a city law because these kindergartners were so stressed out. They had passed a city law that the kindergarten could not teach math. So they were trying to,
Mm.
they're trying to relieve the stress off of these poor kindergartners. But what that did actually was that meant that all of his classmates, because they couldn't teach math in the school, all of his classmates would leave kindergarten and go to a tutoring class afterward so that they could get the math they needed to get into first grade because it was so competitive to get into first grade. So it seemed like whatever adjustments they made to try to make things less stressful, it really often backfired and really did not alleviate the stress.
Wow, that's fascinating. So did your kids have to test to get into school?
They did. In fact, one of the hard things was even though we had 9 months to prepare to get there, we thought, oh, during this 9 months, we can figure out all the schools, and we started applying to schools, which by the way is more like applying to college for your kids. Um, we started applying to these schools and found out that none of the schools would agree to test our kids remotely. So our kids were forced to miss all of the application windows because they wouldn't test them remotely. Finally, when we got there, there were a couple of schools that would test them late, And one of the schools said, okay, we've got a testing slot for you. Show up. It was my first grader and my third grader. Show up at this time. We'll do the test, and then we'll let you know if you got in. Well, I'm coming from the United States where an entrance test in a first grade might be like a 15-minute exercise to see if they know their letters and colors and shapes. Well, we arrived and they took my first and third grader and they said, we'll call you when they're done. And I said, well, how long is it going to be? And they said, probably 3 hours. And
Wow.
it was 3 hours, no bathroom breaks. And that was what they did for first and third graders.
Outside looking in, and I've never lived in Asia. I've never visited Asia. It can seem so weird and wrong because we're just used to something so different. But like you were saying, most people are forced to drop out in ninth grade. So obviously, like the situation is just entirely different. So did you walk away from that experience with the educational system thinking like this is it's different and still wrong? Or did you come to appreciate all of the pressures that cause it to be the way it is and came away with kind of more understanding like, yeah, it's different, but it makes sense given their constraints?
Yeah. I came away still feeling like parts of their education system are wrong. And to be fair, parts of our education system are wrong, right?
Yeah.
But I also came away understanding the decisions that Chinese parents are making because from the outside looking in, we hear phrases like tiger mom, right? Or we kind of have this idea of Asian parents as overbearing and controlling, um, and there's a lot of truth to that. But after living there, I can see why the parents are making the decisions they're making because of the system in which they operate. So I don't think that, I definitely wouldn't recommend replicating their educational system. At the end of the day, I don't think it is a healthy balance for kids. But I understand when parents are in that system why they push their kids so hard and why they feel like they have to do what they're doing.
Did you feel like your kids were completely overwhelmed and stressed, or do you feel like they handled it all pretty well?
My kids are tough, and they're tougher after we did this.
Yeah.
But I'll be honest, I mean, they were in elementary school and there were many tears, a lot of tears at night. And that was hard as a parent because you feel like, you know, uh, I'm the reason that they're
Yeah.
having to go through this. Should I feel guilty that they're having this experience? But we would talk through it. I think one of the hard things for my kids is the Chinese education system is also a lot less maybe a lot less encouraging than in the United States. In the US, you might hear a teacher say, "Hey, good effort," even if the kid is failing. You would never hear that in China, right? My kids came home having been yelled at, belittled, recesses withheld because of test scores, things like that. And so we had to have a lot of conversations about, you know, in it's okay that you're not at the top of your math class. It doesn't mean that you're stupid. It doesn't mean that you're behind. It's okay that it's okay that you didn't score as high as everybody else because our family chose to value your sleep last night, or our family chose to value family time on Saturday. So we just had a lot of like deep conversations with the kids about the choices we were making, and a lot of deep analytical discussions to help them really work through it.
I can't imagine the stress you felt in so many ways, but in one of those in particular, I'm reminded of last fall when we took our family to Italy for a study abroad. I was teaching in Italy for 3 months, and when we arrived, our youngest daughter, Venice, 5-year-old, was just throwing up. And, on the plane ride, she's throwing up, and then we get in the car and we drive another hour, and she throws up like something like 8 to 10 times. And I'm just thinking, like, what am I doing? Why did I cause my daughter to move here, and now it's causing her to throw up. And that was just one day, and like she was fine, and but I could imagine every time there was a stress that you were feeling in China, there's a part of you that's feeling like, why did I come here?
It's my fault.
Yeah,
Yeah, we feel like it's our fault. Like when we were having our kids wear masks at school because the AQI is like 250, and then they come home from school and they say, "Oh yeah, we ran outside for PE. They made us run outside." And I'm like, "Oh no, we've ruined your lungs." There were things like that all the time.
So why are so many students forced to drop out in ninth grade?
So ninth grade, public education in China is only free through ninth grade, and it's not like in the United States, it's expected that you'll go K-12 and that is provided. Of course, there are minor school fees, but in China, it's really only first to ninth, and then after that, if you want to continue to high school, you have to pay for that. So most I mean, this is my limited understanding, right? My kids were not in public school, but most students either drop out because they can't afford high school or because it's clear by then that they are not going to be the top of their class and have a shot at college anyway. And so they'll drop out and, find a more hands-on job like a taxi driver, construction worker.
Really, so it like age 14, 15, 16, there are just a lot of people that are in the full-time workforce.
That Yeah, and once again, I'm not clear if they immediately jump into the full-time workforce, but most of the laborers that I interacted with told me that they only went through ninth grade.
Interesting. So how about cars? Did you want to buy a car? Did you think about having a car? Did you have a car?
Yeah, transportation was very tricky for us, and it's kind of funny because people were always bragging about how wonderful Shanghai's public transportation system is, and it's true. Shanghai's public transportation is phenomenal, but only if you're an adult, right? So here we are with five kids, and everybody's like, "Oh, you're really close to the metro station," but it's a 20-minute walk for an adult, which means a 30-minute walk for the kids. And it was very challenging to get around with all the kids. So yes, we thought about buying a car. The challenge with buying a car is in China, different provinces and cities have different policies for keeping cars off the road, basically, because there's so many people. So in Shanghai, what they do to keep people off the road is license plates are auctioned once a month. There's a set number of license plates that are auctioned, and so if you want to buy a car, first you need to participate in the license plate auction, and usually you'll only get it if you're one of the higher bidders, and that usually comes in around 20,000 USD for a license plate. And then you
Per
can go.
month?
No, just the initial purchase, and then you can go buy the car. So when we did the calculations, it never made sense for us to buy a car, even though it would have been nice to be able to drive our family around all together. What we ultimately concluded was that most of the time we would take taxis, and we did have to take two
Hey, split
taxis.
up.
Yeah, we'd have to split up, and it was a little complicated because you can only order one on one app, and so we have multiple apps and multiple taxis going. But at the end of the day, that was still cheaper because taxis are so cheap in China. It was still cheaper than purchasing a car.
Your children speak Chinese, but does your wife?
She understands it. She hasn't, because she lives in our house, she understands it, but and she can speak a little, but doesn't really. So she could understand. She understands probably 75% of what I say and probably 40% of what Chinese people were saying around us.
Because I'm just thinking if she's taking the kids in a taxi by herself, then like how vulnerable must she be feeling? And if anything, she's depending on like the 5-year-old or whatever to help her.
Exactly. And the kids did translate for her. And I would always try to send her first so that, whichever car showed up first, we'd put her in it because then I never wanted her, waiting for a car that didn't come. So as soon as the first car would come, we'd put her in and then I'd wait for the second car with the other kids.
So again, I just can't even imagine what this would have been like on the day to day. And then you were there during COVID.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
So what
So
was
we
that
were,
like?
well, do you, I'll tell you the story, but I don't want to take too much time. Here's the short version. We were in the US for a wedding when COVID hit. We had brought something like three suitcases because we were only going to be here for 2 weeks. COVID hit China. we ended up staying in the US for 4 years, starting over here and losing everything that we had in China. Um, and then, so that was in 2020. Actually, 2 years later, we did finally make it back to China in 2022. And by then, COVID was over in the US, but COVID was still going in China because China had its zero COVID policy. So we went back to China when things were fine in the US, but it was a very scary time in China. Scary to the magnitude of, if any of your family tests positive, we'll take them for a month into government custody and you will have no visitation rights. So it was a scary time to go back.
Was there a part of you that ever wished you could have stayed in China that whole time, or every day of your life are you grateful that you just happened to be here in the US when the worst of it hit?
Yeah, it's kind of funny because at the beginning, things were fine in China because they controlled it and the United States didn't. For a while, it looked like, everything was going wrong in the US and China was fine. In fact, in-person school continued
Hmm.
all through 2020. My classes, I was online because I was in the US, but my students were all in person and in-person classes continued. So for a while, it looked like China really had it together, but then over time they realize, now the rest of the world has you know gone through the pandemic and is on the other side of the curve, and China still hadn't. And so it wasn't until approximately 5 days before we left China in 2022 again that Beijing did away with all their policies, and COVID ran through the population, and we were there as that was happening.
So you said family separation, if somebody gets COVID, what would have that been like?
So they told us before we came, just as an example, they said if you have a nursing baby, which we always do, right? So they said if you have a nursing baby, you should wean them before you come because upon arrival, if they test positive, the government will take them. Um, they also said if parents ever test positive, the parents will be taken and we will send in government workers to watch your kids for the month until you're released. If your children test positive, they're taken to a Chinese children's hospital, but there's no visitation from parents. And so before we went, we had some serious conversations with the kids about this is what would happen, and we wouldn't see you for a month, and
Oh my
that and
gosh.
it's okay. We still love you, and at the end of the month you'll come back to us and we'll make it through this. So we had some serious conversations like that. When we went back to China, though, they were testing the entire population every 48 hours. We were tested every 48 hours, and school children were tested every 24 hours the entire time we were there. So it wasn't just upon arrival. It was upon arrival, it was during quarantine, and then it was for the duration of your stay in China. If you ever, and it's not just if you test positive, it's also if so they were tracking the location of every phone in China. And if you're ever in proximity of somebody else that tests positive, your QR code turns yellow and your building gets shut down. So several buildings in our complex shut down during the time we were there, and would be shut down for like a week or a few days. I can't remember exactly how long. Um, so it was a very, very weird time to be there.
So every time a child in your family coughs or sneezes, are you getting a pit in your stomach, or had you just kind of gone zen and were just at peace with everything?
Um, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we had already had COVID in the US before we went back. And really the chances of getting it I felt were fairly low because China was being so
Mm.
controlling about it. Um, so we worried, but we didn't worry that much. We did worry at the end when Beijing was starting to lift policies, but Shanghai hadn't, and we could tell COVID was running through the population, but they were still checking QR codes. And there was about a 2 week period there where it was very scary, and we didn't exactly know if they would let us in the airport to board our plane, things like that. Those are the times we worried. But as far as the day to day, once we were in and had gone through quarantine, I was pretty confident that we were okay.
So this is probably an impossible question, but what was the hardest thing that you experienced in all of this time living in China with your five kids?
That's a good question. I maybe this is hard to answer, but maybe the hardest thing was the constant uncertainty. I've never had so many years in a row where there was constant uncertainty. And that's, that's coming out of grad school that feels pretty uncertain all
Yeah.
the time, right? But with China and COVID and there was so much change all the time. I felt a lot of uncertainty, and there were times when I just we took things 1 month at a time, or sometimes 1 day at a time, um, and that was a challenge. But like all challenges, it was good. We learned from it.
As you think back on your experience, then what most surprised you, either maybe culturally about living in China or professionally trying to work in China?
I I think what surprised me the most, and to some people they'll probably listen to this and think, "Duh," but I think what surprised me the most was the difference between customer service, for lack of a better term, in the United States versus China. I was very surprised to find out that, in so many situations, I think the reason it surprised me so much was because it seemed to permeate every corner of our life. It seemed like in every situation, when an organization or a school or a business, it seemed like should have done something or should have been working in a certain way, nobody wanted to help. Nobody wanted to solve the problem at hand. And we could talk a lot about cultural differences, and we've analyzed this a lot, but there's just a very distinct cultural difference where in China the focus is on doing your job description instead of problem solving. And that becomes very clear in every public interaction.
I think about living in South America for a couple of years and the culture there of like, if we have a meeting at 12, that means, we're certainly not going to actually be there at 12. We'll possibly be there at 12:30 or 1, but we may not even show up. Like, at least in the places I live, that was kind of the norm. And it was just so laxed. And there's pros and cons to that. As I think about China, I think about like people who are so driven, motivated, and intense. And so it seems like it would be the opposite. It seems like we're so capable and driven and motivated to complete tasks that we can solve any problem. So that's surprising to hear that your experience was different.
Yeah, and I would say, if South America is on one end of the spectrum, I would maybe say that China is even on the other end of the spectrum. It's very competitive, very fast paced, very high stress. The difference is the focus in probably in the United States, and this is probably because of the free market. In the United States, the focus is usually on um, making the company work and making the customer happy and solving problems as we see them and as they arise. In China, they were very competent and very hardworking, but instead of the focus being on solving problems, the focus was on um, fulfilling exact job description instructions, which didn't always translate to actually helping the customer. Does that make sense? So it wasn't a difference of conscientiousness or anything like that. It was just, I think, a difference of focus on problem solving versus following instructions. And we had some friends over in China that were in the auto industry, and they told us, if you have a car made in China versus a car made in the United States, the car made in China is better, and that's because Chinese people are so good at following instructions. But when it comes to complex problem solving or solving problems that they've never seen before, or the creative critical thinking, things like that, it was very different than our experience in the States.
Well, and you were a walking problem. You
We
were,
were a
right?
walking problem.
They never seen anything
Everywhere
like
we
that.
went, we caused problems. Yes.
So, like the forms that couldn't accommodate you. Any other examples of things that couldn't or didn't accommodate your situations well?
Yeah. So, oh, we have so many. Um, just a simple example. Day one, we show up, they say, okay, now that you've gone through the HR orientation, you need to go open a bank account. Well, nobody told us that in order to open a bank account, you have to first have a Chinese cell phone number. The banks will not open an account for you. Your
Mm.
Chinese cell phone number is like your social security number. So um, because my company, for some reason, hadn't gotten our cell phone yet, we couldn't open a bank account. And we went to open the bank account. They said you can't open it because you don't have a Chinese cell phone number. And before we even got to the bank, I said, "Can you tell us where the bank is?" And they said, "It's that way." And they pointed in a direction, but the problem is we were on the 11th floor of a building, and that didn't help me, right? I needed like instructions once I leave the building, where do I go? And I needed an address or something. And but that wasn't like in their job description to tell me where the bank was. So they didn't take the time to maybe sit down and write it out on paper or draw a map or anything like that. And then when we went back to them and said we can't open a bank account because we don't have a cell phone, there was no effort to solve that. It was just sort of like, well, these are the procedures for getting a cell phone, and so we can't help you until that happens. I remember the first time trying to pay rent wasn't paid on time, and it was the company that was supposed to make the first payment because we were just coming into the country, and I called them and said, you didn't make the rent payment, and they said, oh, well, that's because it's after 1 o'clock on whatever, and there's nothing we can do about that. And there was no, but it wasn't like, let's see what we can do to help, or let's see if we can call the landlord and get an exception, or let's see if we can, expedite the cell phone. Or there was none of that like creative problem solving. It was just sort of, they would give you the answer and that was it, and then you had to hope that somehow things would turn out, but nobody was really trying to help things work out. Nobody
So
was looking at the
interesting.
big picture. So it was just a very different experience.
Okay,
Here
last
in the US, if you went to HR and said, I can't open a bank account, they would think, oh, well, let's work on that. Let's figure out what we can
yeah.
do. Um, that wasn't the case.
Okay, last question then. As you think about this experience, what lesson did you learn that you would most want to pass on to others?
I love this question. Uh, I think what we learned the most was that you cannot make assumptions about other people.
Huh.
I think what we learned the most was to hold off on judgments until and because usually your first impressions or your first layer judgments are incorrect. And this went for both sides. So kind of back to our education discussion, you can look at the education system in Asia and you can draw one of two conclusions. You can say either, well, their math scores are higher, so we need to redo our education system here to be more like theirs, or you can say they're too stressed out, so their education system is horrible. Neither of those conclusions is entirely correct, right? Everything is very nuanced. And once you get in and see what's actually happening, then you can see why people are making the decisions they're making. And people are really reasonable. You just have to first understand where they're coming from. And it was the same vice versa, right? Everywhere we went, people followed us with cameras. Everywhere we went,
Really?
people followed us with cameras. And we had to be very comfortable with the fact that we were being live streamed at all times on Chinese social media or whatever. One morning we woke up and we were in the newspaper and nobody had asked our
Oh,
permission.
are you serious?
So yeah, so we had to be very comfortable with that. But one of the things that happened is as we'd walk down the street, people would make assumptions about us as we went, and I could understand what they were saying, and they didn't know. They would talk to each other and they would say things like, um, oh, those two must be twins, which was not correct. Or they would say, they're Americans, so they only eat steak and hamburgers, which is not correct. I very rarely eat steak or hamburgers. Or they would say things like, oh, the reason they have so many kids is because their government gives them lots of money when they have kids. Things that, were not correct. But those were the assumptions they were making about us, and we were making assumptions about them. And at the end of the day, nobody was right. The more we listened to each other And this kind of goes back to my research, which is on negotiation, right? You walk into the room with a lot of assumptions. If you rely too heavily on those assumptions, you are not going to reach the best deal. What you need to do is realize that your assumptions are just guesses, and then really listen and really try to understand the other party. And then you start to see the nuances, and you start to see that people are reasonable, and there are reasons that they're behaving this way, and greater understanding is built. And I'll just say one other thing about that. We were in China during a very volatile time. The trade war during Trump's first administration was going on, and a lot of people from the US would call us and say, "Hey, we're worried about you because we're hearing all these bad things about China." On the other hand, our neighbors in China would come and say, "Hey, we're worried about you because we're hearing all these bad things about the US." And people would call us and say, "How can you live in China? It's so unsafe." And people would on the street, they would say to us, "How can you live in the US? It's so unsafe." And we were hearing from both sides the misunderstandings. And at the end of the day, that's what they are, is misunderstandings. And it takes a little bit more patience and listening to really understand the other side.
So when you walk into a room now, do you try to limit your assumptions or do you just go in thinking, I'm going to hold these assumptions lightly and test them?
I think the latter. And what I really rely heavily on is the question why. I try to ask people, tell me why that's important to you, or tell me why tell me why you made that decision, rather than, rather than relying on my assumptions. I really want to understand what's behind people's behavior.
Interesting, which goes great in negotiation, right?
Yes.
Why? Can you explain that? I'd like to understand from your perspective.
Oh, yeah. Well, if the more you understand what the other side needs, both parties walk into a negotiation and often say what they want. But what they don't usually say is why they want it. And in negotiation literature, we call this issues versus interests. You walk in and you talk about the issues, but you never talk about the interests underlying those issues. And once and you can see this in real life, and you can see this in as we do case studies in class, and you can see this in the data. Once you move past talking about issues and start asking each other, why do you care about that? A lot of times you can find overlap that you did not see before. And you can actually craft creative deals based on why people care about things, instead of just, spending all your time talking about the numbers. So we make better deals when we stop talking on the surface and we start asking each other, why? Why do you care about that? Why do you need this by then? Why is that price point important to you? Or why are you coming to us now instead of to another company? When you start asking those why questions is when you really understand the party well enough to craft a better deal than you could have if you stayed on the surface.
Such a great lesson, Dave, that is relevant in so many, well, basically every area of life. With that, I just want to thank you for giving us and me the tiniest glimpse of what that must have been like to live in China with 5 children. So great to reconnect. I love hearing these stories and learning from you. So thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Nate.